I'm Teresa Carraggio, and this is Third Paradigm. Today, I'm reading Chapter 18 from my book, How to Dismantle an Empire. This is called World Without Ends, and it's the final chapter of Section 5, Lands of Milk and Money, which has been looking at system change, how to reorganize things in a completely different way and think in a different way about money. In this chapter, I go to the biggest scale of all, of an entire global perspective, and how we, from a grassroots level, can not just take care of ourselves, but also network and work with people from all corners of the world. Of course, after I finish this chapter, I'll be putting that together with the rest of the section and posting that at thirdparadigm.substack.com so that you will have the entire book to be accessed at there. I start with quotes from Wilson Braga, 1985. We have two countries here under one flag, one constitution, and one language. One part of Brazil is in the 20th century, with high technology computers and satellite launches. And beside that, we have another country where people are eating lizards to survive. And then from Chris Cleave, from Little B, most days I wish I was a British pound coin instead of an African girl. Everyone would be pleased to see me coming. A pound coin can go wherever it thinks it will be safest. It can cross deserts and oceans and leave the sound of gunfire and the bitter smell of burning thatch behind. A girl like me gets stopped at immigration, but a pound can leap the turnstiles and dodge the tackles of those big men with uniform caps and jump straight into a waiting airport taxi. Where to, sir? Western civilization, my good man, and make it snappy. And then Fareed Zakaria, The Post-American World. This is a book not about the decline of America, but rather about the rise of everyone else. World Without Ends. While globalization promised to erase borders, the effect has been the opposite. A seismic shift of the ground beneath the rich and the poor, widening the gap between them into an impassable chasm. Within single countries are obscene extremes. As Albert Camus said of Brazil, I have never seen luxury and misery so insolently mixed. In attempts to cross the perilous divide between rich and poor countries, migrants and refugees perish daily or succeed only to win a life of servitude and fear. But borders exist only in the minds and actions of their beholders. As a concept, they have no more tangible reality than money, and like money are verbs describing an action rather than nouns describing things. Their strength lies in their power to maintain a different set of rules for people on either side of an arbitrary line. The purpose of a border is to separate slave owners from slaves so that populations can be subjugated as a whole, and slave owner rights can become a matter of national security. Once a line has been drawn in the sand, or the dirt, as the case may be, to rebel against the rules, or against who gets to make them, is insurgency, no matter how many people agree on the new identity. A border can protect a community's power over itself, or an empire's power over others. If a community isn't allowed to decide for itself where its border ends and what functions it includes, they are the colonial possession of an empire. A modern movement has been turning away from consolidation and towards smaller republics. Let's look at how the world would look if the right to control its own economy was automatically available to any population of a particular size, irrespective of its historical alliance or the name by which it was known. Instead, we'll apply the terms from the last chapter of Commonwealth for hundreds of thousands, eco-states for millions, federations for tens of millions, and trade blocs for hundreds of millions of people. The antidote to civilization. The governments with the largest sets of people are India and China, each with over 1 billion people and over 4 times the size of the next largest country, the United States. The People's Republic of China is a single-party state with jurisdiction over 1.35 billion people in 22 provinces, 5 autonomous regions, 4 direct-controlled municipalities, and the special administrative regions of Hong Kong and Macau. Hong Kong's peaceful return to Chinese rule in 1997 was seen as ending China's century of humiliation. But in the 17 years since, China's policy of one country, two systems has proven to be just another slogan. Candidates for Hong Kong's presidential election are selected by Beijing for their patriotism and loyalty. In 2003, when Beijing insisted that Hong Kong put prohibitions against treason and sedition into their constitution, 500,000 of Hong Kong's 7 million people went into the streets. But Hong Kong is big enough to be its own eco-state, controlling its own economy and protecting its ecosystem and the sovereignty of its own commonwealths. Currently, China is the world's largest exporter and the 3rd largest importer of goods, behind the U.S. and the EU. However, those who make the imports in China are not the same people who receive the imports. China has 482 million people living on less than $2 a day, most of whom are rural peasants who have been driven off the land and into provinces like Guangdong to live in locked barracks and work 14-hour days. The estimated 4 to 5 million child laborers in the economic zones could join as their own federation to protect worker rights. Instead, elementary school children have quotas to braid 1,000 to 10,000 strands of firecrackers a day, which periodically blow up. We might imagine China's 1.35 billion population as 3 or 4 trading blocs, each with a dozen federations made up of a dozen eco-states. Thinking of China in this way raises questions. How should the gambling and shipping nation of Macau, at 600,000 people, relate to the export manufacturing federation of Guangdong, at 80 million residents plus 30 million immigrant workers? Does Macau's gambling hub siphon money away from local economies or bring money into them? Who should regulate access to ports? If China became a number of federations, each controlling their own land distribution policies, would people still migrate away to work in factories, or would they return to being farmers? And will there be workers for the sweatshops now that the generation of the one precious child are all grown up? Walking with the Naxalites. Going in the opposite direction, with a population growth rate of 1.1% per year, are India's 1.3 billion people, 1/3 of whom are under 16. India is divided into 36 states and 678 districts. The Naxalites, also known as the Maoists, are active in 180 districts in 10 states. The Prime Minister has called them the single biggest internal security challenge ever faced by our country, and later told Parliament that if left-wing extremism continues to flourish in important parts of our country, which have tremendous natural resources of minerals and other precious things, that will certainly affect the climate for investment. However, a Planning Commission report on the Maoist movement admitted that, though its professed long-term ideology is capturing state power by force, in its day-to-day manifestations, it is to be looked upon as basically a fight for social justice, equality, protection, security, and local development. Arundhati Roy's book, Walking with the Comrades, portrays them likewise to be a militant peasant force focused on issues of food and local security. She writes, "The Maoist guerrilla army is made up almost entirely of desperately poor tribal people living in conditions of such chronic hunger that it verges on famine of the kind we only associate with sub-Saharan Africa. They are people who, even after 60 years of India's so-called independence, have not had access to education, healthcare, or legal redress. They are people who have been mercilessly exploited for decades, consistently cheated by small businessmen and moneylenders, the women raped as a matter of right by police and forest department personnel. Their journey back to a semblance of dignity is due in large part to the Maoist cadre who have lived and worked and fought by their side for decades. If communities' right to control their own land were universally recognized, they would be considered a public militia for self-defense, not terrorist guerrillas. Operation Green Hunt is a government military program whose CEO's professed goal is to get 85% of India's people off their land and into the cities. It protects the memorandums of understanding that have been written with mining companies for the ores hidden under the land that is inconveniently occupied by peasants. Their strategies include arming paramilitaries that commit unconscionable atrocities and burning villages to flush the Maoists out, creating hundreds of thousands of refugees. If the district government, whose departments collect revenue, police the villages, and manage the forest, worked for the community rather than a distant bureaucracy, none of this could be happening. The Maoists would be farmers who had the right to bear arms in self-defense. The bourgeois democracies of Southeast Asia. The next largest population after the U.S. is Indonesia, with 255 million people. In a trade bloc made up of Southeast Asia, it alone would encompass 3 or more federations. The Philippines and Vietnam, each with over 90 million people, would be large federations on their own. Is it strange to think that in a world where people count equally, the Philippines would have twice as much clout as the Pacific coast of the United States? Or that the whole Northeast U.S., with its knobby backbone of densely populated cities, is smaller in population than Vietnam? Walden Bello of Foreign Policy in Focus was deeply involved with land reform in the Philippines after the 1986 ouster of dictator Ferdinand Marcos. He found that, even more than dictatorships, Western-style democracies are, we are forced to conclude, the natural system of governance of neoliberal capitalism. For they promote rather than restrain the savage forces of capital accumulation that lead to ever greater levels of inequality and poverty. In fact, liberal democratic systems are ideal for the economic elites, for they are programmed with periodic electoral exercises that promote the illusion of equality, thus granting the system an aura of legitimacy. He might apply the old Marxist term bourgeois democracy to describe this kind of government that combines imperialism abroad with elections at home. In an article titled How Liberal Democracy Promotes Inequality, Bello finds that his generation's work to oust dictators in Chile, Brazil, South Korea, and the Philippines didn't result in greater land distribution and self-sufficiency. Using the Philippines as an example, he demonstrates how the elites give a show of electoral competition while consolidating economic power as a class. He writes, "Ultimately, it was not a dictatorship, but a democratically elected Congress that passed the automatic appropriations law that allowed foreign creditors to have the first cut of the Philippine budget. It was not a dictatorship, but a democratically elected government that brought down Philippine tariffs to less than 5%, thus wiping out most of our manufacturing capacity. It was not a dictatorship, but a democratically elected leadership that brought us into the World Trade Organization, opening our agricultural market to the unrestrained entry of foreign commodities and leading to an erosion of food security. Today, even as the elites battle it out in the Philippines' thriving electoral politics, the rate of poverty, at nearly 28%, remains unchanged from the early 1990s. What Bello shows is that it's not the form of government that matters, but the size at which sovereignty can be exercised. Perhaps peasants understand the link between foreign debt or tariffs and food security better than academics. If we were to become masters of unlearning, we might reach the clarity of a Peruvian tenant farmer in the high desert growing asparagus that ships to the U.S. Then we would replace the idiocy of the free market with wisdom rather than rationalization. Home bases in 1,000 places. The 34 U.S. military bases on Okinawa are another demonstration of lost sovereignty. During the U.S. wars on Korea and Vietnam, Okinawa was used to stage bombing missions, thwarting peaceful relations with their neighbors. Due to the military impunity granted to servicemen, sexual assaults happened with frequency, including the kidnapping, rape, and murder of a 5-year-old girl. In addition, chemical and biological weapons have leaked or been field tested there, endangering the rice crop and the water supply. Okinawa has been a sacrifice zone for Japan since it was annexed in the 1870s. To spare the mainland in World War II, Japan localized the violence to the island, so that as many as 1/3 of Okinawans died in the Battle of Okinawa. After the war, Japan signed a peace treaty, but left Okinawa under U.S. military rule. Bulldozers razed houses, and survivors were expelled at gunpoint to make way for military outposts. Today, a new base is being erected at Henoko, despite a mayor elected on an anti-base platform, a poll showing that 80% of residents oppose it, and thousands of protesters staging flotillas, marches, and sit-ins. If the U.S. were a trading bloc rather than a centralized government, would it be able to fund 1,000 military bases around the world, an average of 5 per foreign country? Why would any other federation allow such an imposition? With relative equality of size and the freedom to associate with like-minded others, expansion and domination would be impeded, and the UN Security Council, NATO, the G7, the IMF, the BIS, the WTO, and the WEF would have no purpose. At 1.4 million people, the island of Okinawa could make up its own eco-state with the mandate of protecting its natural resources. It would have neither the ability to sign away the land rights of a commonwealth like Henoko, nor to send in police to suppress resistance. Henoko would be able to align with other peaceful and environmentally minded commonwealths and eco-states. Perhaps they would partner with peace-loving Japanese to bring back the golden age of the Edo Federation. A mosaic of economies. During the Edo period from 1603 until 1868, Japan was a flowering of small-scale sovereignty. Asby Brown lived in Japan for 3 decades and authored several books about the genius of compact yet elegant Japanese architecture. His article for the Global Oneness Project, entitled Living with Just Enough, describes how Japan faced deforestation and dwindling resources, shortages, and famine. But then, after 2 or 3 generations of wise regeneration, the large population was enjoying a quality of life arguably higher than in any contemporary European country. The forests had been saved, agricultural production had increased manyfold, and culture and literacy were on the rise. He describes how a decentralized economy enabled this resurgence. Intriguingly, government policy was most effective when the goals and principles were laid out by the central bureaucracy, and each region was encouraged to develop local solutions. In many ways, this local thinking and responsibility lay at the heart of the success of the program to achieve self-sufficiency and sustainability on a national scale. Though a very active national trade network existed, each of the dozen of fiefdoms into which the country was divided was encouraged to be as self-sufficient as possible. Each village in a fief was encouraged to do the same, as was each family in a village. The result was what we might call a mosaic of economies, in which government and tradespeople were the most dependent on the cash sector, while villagers could meet most of their needs without ever touching money, utilizing a gift economy in which surplus goods were circulated as reciprocal gifts until every household had pretty much what it needed. Ironically, most low-ranking samurai, whose fixed incomes, paid in rice, failed to keep pace with inflation, found themselves increasingly dependent on the same gift economy systems. Unable to buy enough to eat, little by little they converted their urban pleasure gardens into vegetable plots, and, forbidden from selling their produce on the market, secured what they needed by circulating their surplus through a network that included their neighbors and relatives. Brown suggests that, from this necessity to heal the environment and be resource thrifty, they developed an aesthetic that valued the handmade and combined clean and vibrant form with useful function. If few items were possessed, the ones they owned had to be durable, repairable, and appealing to the eye. Even food was artfully presented in the miniature arrangements we call sushi, celebrating bits of seafood with beautiful frames of seaweed and rice. Eurasia. If Japan was finding satisfaction with less during the 18th century to mid-19th centuries, the European empires were all about acquiring more. By 1922, the British Empire ruled over 458 million people, or 1/5 of the planet's then population. Now the United Kingdom has 63 million people. If Scotland's 5 million ride away on unicorns, 3 million Welsh march off playing hornpipes, and 2 million Northern Irish return to the republic from whence they came, it would leave the United Kingdom with 53 million people, one reasonably sized federation. Even Europe's claim to be a continent has the mark of hubris for a peninsula with only 4% of the world's land mass. In a prime example of politics trumping geography, the arbitrary border between Europe and Asia cuts right through Russia, giving Europe 75% of Russia's people and Asia 75% of Russia's land. Dictionaries fumble to define the word continent because a large contiguous landmass, mostly surrounded by ocean, leaves out Europe. Wikipedia writes, "Some view separation of Eurasia into Europe and Asia as a residue of Eurocentrism. In physical, cultural, and historical diversity, China and India are comparable to the entire European landmass, not to a single European country. A better, if still imperfect, analogy would compare France, not to India as a whole, but to a single Indian state, such as Uttar Pradesh. In fact, Uttar Pradesh's 200 million people triples France's 66 million. The Russian Federation is a better comparison, with 144 million people divided into 83 federal subjects, although the term subjects belies federalism because it denies their sovereignty and implies that they serve the Federation, rather than the Federation serving them. Russia encompasses 9 time zones with one expansive country and could be a trading bloc on its own. Without Russia, all of Europe has fewer than 600 million people, which is half the size of India. They could embody one trading bloc with a dozen federations made up of eco-states and commonwealths. The austerity-imposing countries, Germany, France, and the UK, with a combined 250 million people, could each be their own federation and leave the others to their own devices. Perhaps true federalism is the antidote to economic imperialism. Swiss knives and Afghan quilts. True federalism seems to have less to do with the style of government and more with size. According to Johan Galtung, the founder of Peace and Conflict Studies, who negotiates between the Taliban and the U.S., Afghanistan and Switzerland have more in common than you might think. In Democracy Now!, he advised that you have to understand what kind of country Afghanistan is. As Taliban tell me, it's a very, very decentralized country, 25,000 very autonomous villages, and let us say 6 to 8 nations, depends on how you count it. And I remember when we in Transcend, an NGO for mediation, had our first effort there in February 2001, long before 9/11. Then I was asking myself, what country does this remind me of? Which I always do when I mediate. And the answer was Switzerland. Switzerland is the model. Switzerland is a very federal country with very high autonomy down at the local community. Let us say they have 5,000, not 25,000. They have 4 nations, not 6 or 8. And Swiss policy is to be neutral, non-aligned, and to be a very, very deep federation. I think Afghanistan's future will be heading in that direction. They hate Kabul as an overblown, overbloated kind of capital carrying the illusion of a unitary state. It isn't, and I think they would prefer to see a very small center of the country and very high level of autonomy. In addition, they are sick and tired of being invaded. It started with Alexander the Great. You know, this is the place where he became Alexander the Small. And they were invaded by the Mongols, 3 times by the Britons, 1 time by the Soviets, and now by the U.S.-led coalition, as you said, NATO forces. So for them, this is also a war to fight being invaded, a war to end wars. The Swiss Confederation, which is the full name of Switzerland, is comprised of 26 cantons for 8 million people, which comes to about 300,000 people each. But as Galtung indicates, these are further divided into an average of 200 local communities, each comprised of about 1,600 people. Although they don't have a common language, their unity is based on the shared values of disarmed neutrality, federalism, and direct democracy. Decentralization has kept Switzerland out of armed conflict and made Afghanistan an impenetrable maze for invading empires. Few unified nations can say the same. Bolivia, the plurinational. On another continent, the indigenous president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has recognized that the Bolivian state of 10.5 million people contains many autonomous nations and has popularized the term plurinational. The state is divided into 9 departments, which are comprised of 112 provinces sectioned into 339 municipalities, cantons, and native community lands. Averaged out, this would be 93,000 people per province divided into 3 cantons of 31,000 each. However, in practice, plurinationalism is not working out as well as in theory. The World Bank and IMF have never been happier with Bolivia now that a charismatic native leader has quadrupled the areas open to gas extraction, 12 million hectares with over half ceded to multinationals, while steamrolling over regional sovereignty. There has also been an acceleration of mineral mining and agro-monocultures, mostly in soy production, and a highway project is plowing through both tribal land and a national park, with more development sure to follow. To be fair to Morales, however, any elected head of a resource-rich country is in a bind. Given an implicit choice, most people will prefer to consume more than they produce. This standard of living is only made possible in 2 ways: selling the natural resources of internal colonies or using foreign militarism to dominate and exploit external colonies. While state and World Bank officials point to Bolivia's rising GDP and narrowing income disparity, the cost of food is also rising, which affects the poor disproportionately, creating more dependence on money. Meanwhile, Bolivia's treasury is accumulating a surplus, which it sprinkles into social programs, buying off the opposition and repressing protest when that fails. But charity is not sovereignty, and a handout doesn't replace social justice. If Bolivia were apportioned ethnically, there are roughly 2.5 million Quechuans, 2 million Aymaras, and 3 million mestizos. This is enough to each have their own eco-state, with another comprised of Euro-Americans, including the German-speaking Mennonites, and other ethnic nations like the Guaranis and Afro-Bolivians. If one eco-state failed to keep its charter to protect its natural resources, its commonwealths would be free to join another. Then, if those in urban areas wanted to consume without producing, they would have only their own natural resources or labor to sell. A handout or hands up. The sole function of an eco-state is to protect the natural resources shared by the Commonwealth under its alliance. The smaller the community, the less their ability to outsource the real costs, such as the arsenic in Chiapas water from gold mining, or the destruction of the mountains of India from bauxite mining. When one centralized government makes decisions for remote regions, they become internal colonies. The United Mexican States, as a federation of 120 million people, has been one such government that controls rather than negotiates between its 31 entities. In 1900, the population was only 13 million. The nearly tenfold increase has resulted in nearly half being under 25 years old. While the birth rate has dropped from 5.7 per woman to 2.2 in recent decades, the boom created an urban migration. 1/5 of Mexicans now live in the metropolitan area of Mexico City, and 3/5 live in other cities, leaving only 21 million who are rural. Mexican policies had disregarded this minority who live off the land. But the countryside fought back. On the day that NAFTA went into effect, January 1st, 1994, a peasant army declared war on the Mexican government, seized major cities in the state, burned down the army barracks, and freed the prisoners. Today, in the free and sovereign state of Chiapas, over 1,000 Zapatista communities in resistance have joined together in 38 autonomous regions. The Zapatistas have just celebrated 20 years of mass militancy, guarding the people from attack by paramilitary troops. Today, in the 5 Zapatista caracoles, as the regional centers are called, government handouts are banned as bribes to create dependency. Health clinics mix traditional cures with allopathic medicine, and the school curriculum is set by community and taught in the indigenous language. A recent addition to the caracoles is La Escuelita, or the Little School, where 4,000 foreign students have come to be paired with tutors and placed in host homes to learn freedom according to the Zapatistas. With a population of 3.4 million people, Chiapas is a working model of an eco-state, where local identity and horizontal organizing are being explored. Perhaps with a new government in Mexico, it might be truly free and sovereign, so their youth wouldn't need to protect against Mexican troops and paramilitaries, and could concentrate once again on farming. And finally, may the Federation be with you. A federation is based around an ideology. It might be neutrality and democracy, like Switzerland, or tribal independence, like Afghanistan. It could be mutual aid in disasters, shared opportunities in higher education, or better coverage in healthcare. A federation's goal could be to support farmers at home and abroad and prioritize their needs. Another federation might grow a generation of doctors or artists or teachers. Although each republic is responsible for itself, a federation could provide the neural network to communicate ideas. There are no easy answers to these questions, but applying the golden rule to governments means that whatever rights and privileges would be claimed for one's own community must be recognized in its policies towards other social bodies. If governments were judged merely on their internal and external consistency, another world would be possible. Each commonwealth would be a republic of abolitionists who could buy their own freedom by freeing the slaves. Our eco-states would protect our resources and collaborate to reverse climate change if that's their goal. Our federations would preserve the best of globalization, so an African girl could jump the turnstiles more easily than a British pound, and money and weapons would stop at borders so that people could be free. Each chapter ends with a lexicon of words that I've defined here and also questions for reflection and discussion. And then this is the paradigm shift in this chapter. There are only two human rights: the right of community self-governance and community ownership of land and resources. Human rights are predicated on community rights. And to follow up with 2, showing why we need to look at a world without ends instead of the end of the world, this is the West versus the rest. And this one is World War III or worldwide wrestling. Thank you for watching.